to the first episode of the YLP Hockey PodKass. I'm your host, Josh Cass, and we are sponsored by the Weiselberg Law Firm. For nearly 20 years, you have entrusted Elliot with the growth and guidance of your kids, and now it's time to let him do the same for your family's most important asset, your home. Admitted in both New York and New Jersey, Elliot can help guide you through any residential or commercial purchase, sale, refinance, or lease, and he'll do it with championship quality and award-winning care. If you're looking for your commercial coach or a new home is your goal, please reach out to the Weiselberg Law Real Estate Services today at 917-952-2597, or you can send them an email at wiselawsk@gmail.com, reminding everyone once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely. So I'll start with the elephant in the room. The podcast is no longer called Yeshiva League Pass Face Off. The Hockey Podcast is just a new title. So even though this is the first ever episode of this series, so to speak, and it is theoretically the first season, this will be the fourth season overall that Yeshiva League Pass has a hockey podcast on it. So just want to go through everything with you guys so far that we've done the last 3 years. We've done interviews. We've talked some power rankings. We've made some playoff predictions and regular season predictions. That's all the stuff that's still going to be happening on this podcast. So without further ado, this is the first episode. So obviously we're going to be doing our sort of predictions and rundown for how I would expect the season to go. And you'll see me bringing in other names as the season progresses. But with that being said, let's get right into it. So we only have JV today. There will be a separate varsity episode. JV only has 8 teams, so one less team than there was last season when there were 9. Now, interestingly enough, JV had 9 teams last year in their league, and they did not have separate divisions. It was one big division or one big league. This year, there are 8 teams, and there are 2 separate divisions. We go back to the format of the so-called West and East conferences. The East Conference has DRS, Hafter, YDE, and Rambam as their 4 teams, and the Western Conference has TABC, Frisch, SAR, and MTA as their 4 teams. So the only team that dropped out from last season was Ramaz. Other than that, the other 8 teams are back in the league this year. So we're going to get straight to the predictions, or I don't know if you want to call them predictions, but really the rundown of what these teams did over the off season, so to speak. Obviously, it's not like professional sports where you can go out and acquire free agents or trade for players. It doesn't happen like that. But there were some interesting things. We'll talk about the notable departures for these JV teams, so the 10th graders that graduated up to the varsity level, and we'll talk about some of the incoming 9th graders or the 9th graders from last year that'll be more impactful, or that should be expected to be more impactful on this year's teams for the JV level. So we're going to start off with last year's champion, the SAR Sting. The SAR Sting last year, and obviously that means we're starting the Western Conference, but the SAR Sting last year had a predominantly 10th grade team. They were led by Jack Linhart and Nate Zitter at the scoring front, and they had key pieces like Ellie Fenster, Jacob Rosenstein, Etan El-Sadi on the back end, as well as some depth. And those were really the 5 main, I would say untouchable pieces. Those were their big 5 that people really just could not find a way to compete with. And there were some other great pieces in there as well. Obviously, the goaltending was great with Michael Goldman. They obviously had some great freshman contributors who we'll get to, but most notably guys like Jonah Neowitz and Jack Duche, Stephen Shama, who are all up there. And so it really, or maybe Shama's a 10th grader. Now, with that being said, I did just mention Jack Duche, Jonah Neowitz, also a Dean Cattler, but hold up, I'll get there. Those were 3 guys for them last year that really played a huge part in their success from the freshman class. Then obviously everyone knows about Nate Zitter, Jack Linhart, Jacob Rosenstein, Ellie Fenster, Natan El-Sadi, Eitan Adler, all of these guys who were huge for them. And of course, Michael Goldman in net. This SAR Sting team does have some pieces around from last year. They also got some new freshmen who are not 100% playing a role, or it doesn't seem like they will play a role. One of the big changes that I'm going to be interested to look out for is that Chase Fishman is, a top goalie for his age, and there's talk about him potentially transitioning to player because they have Kolb to play net for them, who was the backup on last year's championship winning team for SAR. So that'll be something interesting. And the other thing is Jonah Neowitz is going to be arguably the best defenseman in the league, if not just straight up the best defenseman in the league. Jack Duché, I would expect to be a very, very strong scoring presence on that team and around the league as well. And Dean Cattler, who was the other one of the big three freshmen that I mentioned from last year's ninth grade class, actually transferred to TABC over the summer. So he will not be around for the ride with SAR this season. That's going to be a big piece for them that they're going to be missing from last year's team, who was a key contributor for them. I'll get to him and I'll mention him when I get to TABC, which will be very shortly because we are doing the Western Conference first. But that's what we have for SAR. And certainly need to say that their team did get worse on paper. However, who knows? I think this is the team that probably has the most unknowns. And sometimes, as we've seen in years past, the team with the most unknowns can end up being the team with the biggest, positive surprise. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with them. And you also can't count them out because of their coaching. Jacob Schwartzman, Yuta Blonder, Jason Shivitz have done a terrific job since stepping into their program and taking it over after the Falcons teams left. And every year they've been there, they've won at least one championship on either the JV or the varsity level. It's only been over the last 2 years, but they're going for three in a row at some level right now. And we're going to see if it happens. Moving on, we're going to go over to the next team that finished in the West as close to SAR as anyone did, and that was Frisch. So Frisch last year had a very good mix of 10th and 11th grade students on their JV hockey team. They were led by Albie Hornblass on offense, Howie Rudolph in net, and they had some very big contributors on the freshman side of things, guys like Charlie Butler, Sammy Perlman, Ryan Teller, who were really, I would say, their big three in terms of the freshmen last year who got time. And they are a very solid team coming into this season. And you take into account guys who are either transferring or guys who are coming in from the middle school level, for their first year in ninth grade in the JV league. And we're going to see the addition of guys like Josh Goldman, who's coming from North Shore. Family is going to be in Jersey from now on. So he's going to end up in Frisch. That's a big piece that they're getting right there. They're going to end up with, of course, their goaltending. Also, they have guys who I forgot to mention before, so I'll mention it now. Guys like Eitan Kleinhaus and Zach Nussbaum, who are around, who will probably take over the reins for this year. I don't know if they're going to go tandem, but it's possible that they might or that they won't. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. They have JJ Essner transferring over from, I believe, Ramaz, if I'm not mistaken. He was at Camp David and a phenomenal player there. So he's going to come in. I would expect him to be a big piece going forward. And then obviously, I mentioned Butler, Perlman, Teller. Those are their big three guys, if you ask me what I think about Frisch's team. And this all translates to the fact that their offense should be very, very strong. The big question for me is going to be the defense and the goaltending, because the goaltending, even with Kleinhaus and Nussbaum taking it over, shouldn't be otherworldly. They can hold down a fort, but I think that they still have steps to take forward before they can really be considered at the top of the class in terms of the goaltending there. And their defense, although they can play Butler and Perlman there together, they both did it in Yavne for some time. And, they do have a very versatile team in terms of who can slot where in the lineup and at what position. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, because do you want to ride a rotation of, 6, 7 guys throughout the entire season? It's possible. It can be done. It has been done. It's rare, but it's going to be interesting to see if that's the route that they decide to go. And so, again, I'm looking at this first team and saying they should be able to go out there and score the doors off of teams, but will they keep the ball out of their net to the same level that they can score goals? And they could score goals at a very high level. So can they keep the ball out of their net at a very high level. It's going to be very interesting to see. I also want to shout out other guys, obviously Pacey Hornblast, Yona Honig, Max, excuse me, not Max, Ami Borger, guys who will play roles this year on the team. Borger was one of the top, not one of the top freshmen, one of the top eighth graders coming out of Noam last year. Honig and Hornblast guys who were big pieces on the Yavned team a couple of years ago when they were in eighth grade. So, going to be interesting to see. A lot of these guys have played together, and they're all coming back together. I'm saying they played together in middle school. Now they're coming all to play together in high school. So there will be some pre-developed chemistry there that I think definitely helps them out. But again, the big question, I know I'm repeating it because I keep making points in between, is going to be, can they keep the ball out of their net at the same high level that they could score goals? We'll see. It's going to be interesting. Moving on, we are going to go to the next team in the West, and that is TABC. TABC last year missed the playoffs on the JV level for the first time in their history. And I was talking to Mo Fuchs about it, and he said that it had never happened before. I asked him when was the last time that TABC missed the playoffs on the JV level or ever. He told me the year for varsity. I don't remember, but we'll get to that when we do the varsity episode. They had been on a roll and they missed the playoffs last year. And there is, I think, this sort of take that's been going around to say that they shouldn't have missed the playoffs. And TABC could have been in the mix. They had a very up and down schedule and season last year. So we already talked about it at the end of last year, but it's a new year for them. If I'm the TABC JV coaching staff, I would be thinking about forget last year and let's just go forward with this year because everyone is either going to expect us to not play well because we missed the playoffs last year and they weren't under the impression that they had such a talented freshman class last year, but I'll get to that. And the other side of it is, they're TABC. They should just make the playoffs because people expect them to do that. I will get there. But the way I look at it is TABC was in a very weird situation last year because their 10th grade class last year, when they were ninth graders, didn't play at all. Then you get to last year, and they were sort of forced to have to play in big moments no matter what. They got a good freshman class last year. Let's make that clear. But I feel that there was so much pressure that was on TABC, or a lot of people looked at TABC last year on the JV level and said, these guys in 10th grade need to step up. And when they didn't, they sort of started playing the ninth graders and they were already, mathematically eliminated from the playoffs at that point. So no one really got the full sight or understanding of what that ninth grade class last year could have been or how much they could have contributed. So there was a little bit of an unknown factor to them in terms of what their ceiling would be this year coming into the league as 10th graders and being, the older side of things on the JV level. So it's going, I thought it was going to be interesting going into last year because I knew a little bit more about that ninth grade class, but this year even more so now that I know and other people may not, you know, seeing this TABC JV team, I'm telling you, I really believe there is a chance this team could not only make the playoffs, but win the championship. They're deep. They have a big 10th grade class this year, guys who, even as I'm being told, have moved up to varsity because there were so many guys. And, maybe Mo wants to have some of the guys he thinks, ready for development can come up to his varsity team. And I don't know about perform there, but definitely get good experience there. And they're also getting a very solid ninth grade class. Just to talk about some of the names on this team, they'll likely be led by guys like Aaron Brothman and Jake Rubenstein on offense, who got some time at the end of last year for the ninth graders. And they'll also likely be led by David Ratzersdorfer and Marty Teitelbaum on defense. And then they're going to be getting two of the best scorers out of the eighth grade class from last year, who will be ninth graders this year. That will be David Allen from YNJ and Jack Solomon coming over from Kushner. Bit of a longer commute for him. Not going to get into that. Bottom line is, TABC looks like they are going to have a lot of bright spots on this team on paper coming into this season. How they'll put it together, I'm really not sure. A lot of people thought they should have made the playoffs last year and they didn't. A lot of people may be thinking the same thing this year. It's possible that they'll miss. You never know. The truth is, you never know until it all comes into fruition. That's the point of this podcast where I break everything down for you guys. And then, if it comes into action, we address what happens. But with that being said, and I also don't want to shy away from the goaltending. Excuse me, I forgot about it for TABC. But they had a few goaltenders on their team last year, so much to the point that guys literally got moved up to varsity. A guy, specifically Saul Sandell, last year was moved up to the varsity team for TABC because they thought his potential and his ceiling was so high that if he got a year playing on last year's TABC varsity team, which was incredible, and if he performed there, whether it be in practice or even in games, then he could come back to the JV level and be a huge game breaker for them. So it's going to be interesting to see. The word on the street is he's going to be on the JV team this year, and he should be the starting goaltender. It should almost be a consensus. But other options they have, they're going to have Ian Mandelbaum, who's around for another year. They'll have Max Moskoff, who's coming out of middle school to join TABC, younger brother of Ethan Moskoff, for those of you who have heard that name before. And with that being said, they're going to have depth. And like I said, I believe they will have scoring and they will have defense. The question is going to be how much of it are they going to be able to use to their advantage? And, to what extent are they going to lean on certain guys more than others if they have depth and, aren't really using it to their full advantage? So we'll see what happens there. It's going to be very interesting. However, you know what? I'll get to it later when I do the predictions for you guys. The last team in the West is MTA. MTA did not have a strong season last year. However, they also didn't have such a bad season either. You look at it and you say this team didn't come close to making the playoffs. They were a couple points out. With that being said, they were not blown out in every single game last year. They were in almost all of their games last year, really, with just the exception to a game against DRS and maybe a game against SAR or Frisch. But other than that, I mean, they beat Hafter last year. Hafter made the semis and almost made it to the championship. They lost in overtime in DRS. And, they were able to play close with Ramaz. They were able to play close with YDE. They beat Rambam. There were definitely some bright spots there for them. The question was going to be, what were they going to get out of their 10th grade class for this year, or what will they get out of their 10th grade class for this year? Because their ninth grade class was really not that deep or really not that big either. So certainly going to be interesting. And that was answered sort of on the flip side because we know their 10th grade class wasn't so deep, but they got a very deep ninth grade class this year. Most of the guys coming over from YCQ, so you're going to be looking at some guys like Yoni Schlechter and Kobe Gomberg, Yisrael Gurman, guys just to name a few who are going to be in on the mix. They're also going to have some of the guys returning from last year. Like I know there's a Cooper from last year's team who should be expected to play well. I believe Avi Beer is going to be back on the team this year, so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. And of course, I forgot the big piece, Justin Schickman there, who should be, at least in my opinion, the starting goaltender for this team. I'm also hearing about a coaching shakeup there. I believe it's going to be Kobe Kasdan stepping in behind the bench this season, so that'll be interesting. A good hockey mind who I know he definitely has the experience. He won a championship or a co-championship with DRS. He's played in big games. It's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And I would certainly like to think this team will be better this year than it was last year. But whether or not that happens, we're going to have to wait and find out. That wraps it up for the West. Let's move on to the East. So in the Eastern Conference, we'll start again in the order of teams and where they finished last year. So we're starting with DRS. DRS last year was the runner-up in the league, lost in the championship to the SAR Sting by a final score of 4-1. I announced that game along with Jacob Weiss, if you guys caught that. And with that being said, DRS last year had a drop off from where they were the previous 2 years on the JV level, where yes, they still made the championship. However, the team was not as good on paper or sort of lacked the talent that they had in the previous couple seasons. This year, I think they're closer to where they were last year in terms of the talent level, their star power and how this team is sort of constructed. But it's the same expectation every single time. And with DRS, they're always going to be a team that's going to work hard. They're going to hustle. They're going to play very strong defense. That's always been a huge piece of what makes them successful all season long. If you guys don't remember, I'll remind you now, Larry Gross last year, when I asked him about why he played guys like Josh Lampert and Ami Marks on defense last year when they were offensemen before, he said, one of the things you need to look at when you're building your team and when you're placing guys in their positions and when you're structuring your lines is who's going to help you keep the ball out of your net. That's the first thing I look at, because if you can't keep goals out of your net, you can't win games. Same way you can't score, you can't win. But it starts with defense and defense first. That's been DRS's motto. Now, that was the reason why he went with the lines the way he went with them last year. Now, the big news of the offseason, for those of you who haven't heard, is Larry Gross is no longer going to be with DRS. So they have some new coaches in place. Some are new entirely, and some of them are returning from his staff in the last few seasons. So we're talking about JV. That's going to be an entirely new staff, and it's going to be Hill Golubchik and Rafal Gamal this year. Two great hockey minds. Golubchik has been a name. Also, he was part of that team that was undefeated going into the COVID year that would have played in the championship against Ramaz for DRS, but they didn't play it out, so they were crowned co-champions. But plenty of successful years in DRS throughout the 3 years prior. Also, great career at YCQ. They were in championships left and right when he was there. And then you take a look at Rafal Gamal, who won a championship with YCQ and also played in many big games with DRS as a goalie. So you bring a guy who knows how to run offense, defense in Golubchik, a guy who knows how to strengthen the goaltending in Gamal. I expect this team to be, at the very least, competitive. I think that's a fair assessment. And just to name some guys on the back end and on offense for them, we'll start with defense because that's what DRS is most known for. But obviously, they're going to have a big returning name in Sam Goldstoff, who really, really, really did a great job last year coming onto the scene, especially in that Hafter game. And I would expect a guy like Elon Freundlich to take a big step forward again this year. He was huge for Halb 2 years ago when he was an eighth grader and they made it to the championship. In net, you're likely going to be looking at Max Isaacs as the starting goaltender, who, when he's on his game, is absolutely phenomenal. And we know that from his days at Halb as well. And you're on offense, you're going to be looking at guys like Eitan Rogoff, who will be making a return from last year, who stepped up and started getting more time as the season progressed. You're going to be looking at a guy like Ozzy Herskowitz. Can he take another big step forward this year? He did last year. And then they're going to be getting some guys from last year's Halb team that was in the championship. And you're going to be looking at guys like, on defense, specifically, I'll start with defense because they were deeper on defense. You're going to be looking at Benjamin Papilski. You're going to be looking at Max Katz. You're going to be looking at, other pieces. And then, sorry, those are the two on defense, the two big guys to look out for. And then on offense, you're going to be looking at a guy like Gabriel Axelrod. You're going to be looking at a guy like Ben Mischer. You're going to be looking around this DRS team and seeing, all right, there's a lot of guys stepping in who could be ready to play for them in this coming season in JV. And then just to name a few other guys who will be stepping in other areas, Boaz Kahn and Zevi Deutsch will probably be good choices to help Max Isaacs out in net. So DRS will have a trio of options there if they feel that they need to take a different approach for whatever reason. And, it's going to be an interesting season for them. But with that being said, I think this team should be competitive, even without, and it's a big loss. And I'm not holding this against Gamal and Golubchik on really on the bench for this thing. But Larry Gross is going to be out of DRS for the first time, if not ever, then a very long time. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. With that being said, let's move on to the next team that we have to talk about, and that is Hafter. Hafter last year finished in the semifinals. They lost in overtime against DRS in DRS, and they actually had two leads in that game. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens with them because last year's team, good mix of ninth and 10th graders, but more key contributions from the ninth graders. You're looking at a big, big, big loss in a guy like Zachy Weiss. And of course, that's not going to help them. However, they're going to have plenty of guys who are still sticking around from last year, most notably guys like Drake Spodek, Jacob Stern, Sammy Mayer, and of course, you're going to have Zach Ransdorfer in net, so he should be able to just fit right in and take over the reins from where Matty Blonder was when he took them over last year as the starting goaltender after Max Newmark graduated out onto the 11th grade side. And so with that being said, a lot of last year's returning pieces. And, with that being said, it's also going to be interesting to see what happens because their ninth grade class is coming predominantly from Hafter with a couple transfers from other middle schools. And their ninth graders, or rather last year's eighth grade in Hafter, won the championship with a perfect season. And you're going to be looking at guys like Kobe Weiss and Jonah Gober, Sam Spira and Net, who were all big pieces for them on last year's championship team. I also don't want to shy away from a guy like Jack Fight or Ethan Grossman. Were both good for them in that big game. Well, not just that big game, but especially that big game for them. Grossman had the game tying goal with less than 20 seconds left. And I already mentioned Kobe Weiss, who had the other two goals in that championship game, including the winner in overtime. And of course, Sam Spira should be a solid goalie. And look, if they don't want to go with Brandsdorfer, then Spira is a guy who I think can come in and maybe fit in also. Might take him a game or two, but these are all guys who should be ready to play come ninth grade immediately. That's how good they were. And when you fit them in with a bunch of guys who already contributed at a very high level as ninth graders last year, they bring the experience and sort of to be able to pay that forward to the ninth grade class this year. Again, most of these guys, also the 10th graders, went to Hafter Middle School. So they've played with these guys before. It's sort of like the situation in Frisch where there is pre-built chemistry already. And I also want to talk about two big transfers for them, for guys who are coming in from different feeder schools. One of them is Daniel Coven, who is going to be huge, or excuse me, David Coven. I apologize, they're brothers. David Coven, who's going to be a big piece for them, or I would expect could be a big piece for them coming out of YCQ from last year, who was good for that team. And the other one, who might be a bigger name that people would know about, is Judah Heller. Judah Heller was one of the three best offensemen on Halb last year. Halb made the championship, scored a goal in that championship game for them, and he's coming over to Hafter. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. I would certainly expect this team to be in the mix to be able to make a run, and who knows, maybe they're the team you're looking at the top of the Eastern Conference this year, maybe because they have a bit more known factors or proven factors than DRS does, and they almost had their number last year as a younger team. We'll see what happens. It's going to be very interesting. I also want to talk about a quick coaching change there, or not really a change, it's more of an addition, but Avidan Berman is going to be in on the mix. And I guess you could call it a change, actually. Zach Levy leaving Hafter, Avidan Berman coming in. Going to be interesting to see. I don't really feel like they're losing much when you replace a guy like Zach Levy with Avidan. If anything, maybe they're gaining anything. So going to be interesting there to see. Avidan's a guy who's proven he can win on multiple different levels. He's done it in high school as a coach. He's done it in middle school. He was part of the coaching staff that won YCQ its only championship, along with Elliot Weiselberg, when some of the guys this year, or not some of the guys this year, some of the new coaches this year were eighth graders. So that's going to be interesting to see, but we'll see what happens there with Hafter. Moving on, our next team is YDE. YDE made it to the wild card game last year and then lost to Frisch. YDE is an interesting team to me, and I say that because 2 years ago, when they were on the middle school level, they made it to the semis. Now, some of those guys haven't come back, some of those guys have. There have been some position changes. It's, a new coaching staff. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. But the two biggest names on this team that we need to talk about are Alan Fallis and Steven Franco, without a doubt. Alan Fallis, defenseman who has the ability to play offense, absolutely outstanding. He's great fundamentally. He's got incredible skill. He's fast. He's big. He can really control the play defensively. And he's got a scoring touch too. He's versatile, as I mentioned. He can play offense. Steven Franco, though, for me, is the bigger piece because Franco broke the league record in middle school, scoring 40 plus goals in his eighth grade season. And last year, he was very good for this YDE team as a ninth grader. He exploded onto the scene. I think he was a big part of the reason, at least from what I saw last year, why YDE had such a successful season as opposed to where many people thought they would be, which was at the bottom of the league with a mostly ninth grade team in terms of guys who they were looking at for contributors. So my question is, can they get the eighth grade version of Steven Franco on the 10th grade level? Will he be able to go out there and just score the doors off of teams? And that's how YDE can have their success? Or are they going to lock down on him more now, knowing what he's fully capable of and with new teams in the mix? Remember, they didn't, the middle school teams don't play the Jersey teams. They're not in the same league when they're in middle school. They're two different leagues. So now that some of those teams have seen him, guys like Frisch, like TABC, like SAR, do they have the same awareness for him coming into this year that they may or may not have had? And if they don't have that same awareness, can they adjust? That's going to be my big question for them. You know, it's going to be interesting to see. I know Joey Saff is not the head coach on the JV level, but he plays a part in that program. Obviously, David Sutton's going to be behind the bench. It's going to be interesting for them. He's proven he can win, with or without high end talent or with or without a 10th or ninth grade dominated team. I would expect this team to be competitive. The question for me is going to be because of the amount of teams that make the playoffs, will they be able to get in because of the format? That's going to be my ultimate question, which I'll get to when we talk about the playoff format. Moving on to the next and final team we have to talk about in the East and the league, that's Rambam. Rambam last year finished 0-10 at the bottom of the league. And they really didn't have a team that, when structured, you looked at and said, lock them in to go 0-10 because they had some good pieces on last year's team. Where they struggled was being able to finish games. They had Aaron Solomani, a rookie goalie or a ninth grade goalie. Yeah, it's basically a rookie, who was fine for them. You would look at him and say, he's not the strongest goalie in the league. He's not the weakest goalie in the league. And you would look at their offense and defense and say they have one of the top players in the league in Moshe Holzer. They have a very strong offenseman who can pair with him in Elon Klein. They've got two rock solid defenders, excuse me, and Isaac Mastery and Moshe Feldman. Where it was beyond that was kind of a mystery because no one really knew what they had coming in. So when they went 0-10, it did shock some people knowing they had a guy who could score goals at the rate Moshe Holzer could score them and guys who could shut down an offensive pair like Feldman and Mastery. But it sort of spiraled out of control. And it's not like they were blown out every game, even against the top teams. I mean, look, they lost like 10-7, 10-6 to Hafter. I get it. You give up 10 goals, you don't expect to win. But when you score 7 or 6 on the team, and they had a lead in that game, when you score that many goals on a team that's known for their shutdown play, you know, it's interesting. It's very interesting to see sort of what went wrong. And I really believe this year, like maybe a lot of people don't think that there is a lot that really makes you think they should finish any differently. However, look, they're going to have some of the same pieces around from last year who have been getting better. I know that excuse me, I know that they're still going to have Aaron Solomani in net, who should be one of the better goaltenders in the league. They're getting Ephraim Gantrow, who was one of the top players last year in the middle school league, the captain from Hartor, who was a good defensive team last year. Like, there are pieces on this team I know that will help them keep the ball out of the net. I want to go back to that saying from Larry Gross, saying defense is what he looks at first, and it's what helps you win. My question is going to be on offense, what are we going to get from this team? Because are you going to be relying on the fact that Solomani can keep the ball out of the net and Gantrow is going to be your guy you'd look at and say he's going to score all of our goals for us? How's it going to work out for me? That is my big question. And it'll be interesting. I think they will be better than they were last year. I really do, even with some of the talent that they had last year. It's going to be interesting to me because a lot of these other teams are a bit more proven already because of what we know about them from last year. The Rambam definitely has the most unproven team, and that's not a good thing or a bad thing because, as I said when I spoke about SAR, they've got a lot of unknowns. It may be a pleasant surprise. For all we know, we could see this Rambam team sneak into the playoffs. You never know. You never know, and it's going to be interesting to see. With that being said, we are now going to talk about how the playoffs work. Okay. The playoffs work like this. Last year, first of all, I'll compare them. There were 9 teams in the entire JV league. This year, there are 8. Last year, the 1 seed, the 2 seed, and the 3 seed got a bye straight to the semis. The 4 and 5 seeds played each other in a wild card game or a play-in game. The winner of that game made it in as the 4 seed. So 5 seeds technically made the playoffs, but obviously only 4 went to the semis. So the 4 and 5 seeds played in a playing game. The 4 seed hosted. Last year, that 4 seed was YDE. Frisch was the 5. Frisch went to YDE and beat them there. Frisch played SAR, who was the 1. DRS played Hafter in the 2-3 matchup, and then it went from there. Hafter lost to DRS. Frisch lost to SAR. SAR beat DRS in the championship. This year, since there are 8 teams, 4 teams make it into the playoffs. However, there are 2 different conferences, as I mentioned in the beginning. And as a result of that, we are going back to a similar format from how it was on the varsity level a couple of seasons ago, where it's going to be a total of 4 seeds making it in, but you can't have all four teams from one division make it in. It's going to be the one seed in each division. So the winner of the West and the winner of the East will make it in. And then there are two wild cards. So it could be two from the East, two from the West, or one from each. If I had to put a prediction on it, which is probably what we will close with, I would have to say the following. I would say that DRS wins the East and that TABC wins the West. After that, there are two wild cards. And it's interesting to me because I know I talked about how you can look at a team like YDE and say, because of the playoff format, and this is what I was getting at, can they make it in? I looked at a team like SAR and I said, are we going to be pleasantly surprised by them in terms of them being able to possibly make it in? And I think ultimately what it comes down to is going to be, the strength of schedule, who's going to have who, or who's going to play who. And the truth is, everyone's going to play everyone. That hasn't changed. It's going to be the double games, or the teams that you play twice that could potentially determine that. And in looking at that, what I know is that in the West, because they're going to keep it more around the teams that are in your own division. But when I'm looking at that, I just already said TABC and DRS are going to be the ones and twos, but I think after having to play DRS twice may end up being something that could float them down, which is why I didn't have them winning the division. I do still think I would give the edge to DRS. And in terms of TABC and Frisch, I know Frisch finished higher last year, but knowing that TABC, I think, is the more complete team this year with better goaltending, with potentially better defense. If they can't keep up offensively with Frisch, but they can make up for it on the back end, that's where it goes for me, putting them ahead of Frisch. I believe that Frisch will still make the playoffs from the West as one of the wild cards, and that it would likely be between Hafter and SAR. And just because Hafter has so many pieces returning from last year, as well as a great addition of ninth graders this year, both from their middle school, which won the championship, as well as some of the other schools who were good teams in the league last year and good players from those teams coming in, I would have to put them ahead of SAR. So my final prediction for the four teams making the playoffs is split. Two from the East, two from the West. TABC as the one seed from the West, Frisch from the two seed from the West, or as the two seed from the West. And then we have DRS, or I have DRS as the one from the East and Hafter as the two from the East. I could be very wrong. And there's a good chance I will be very wrong, but there's only one way, as you guys know, that I've said in the past, to find out what's going to happen, and that's to watch it play out. So that breaks it all down for what we should be expecting to see, or what we could be expecting to see coming into the JV League this season. And I want to thank you all for tuning in to the first ever episode of the Yeshiva League Pass Hockey Podcast. And again, I want to thank the Weiselberg Law Firm for sponsoring, reminding everybody once again, that's the Weiselberg Law Firm. Please choose wisely.